You stupid girl. The voice cut through the ambient jazz like a hunting knife. Every head in the Grand Virginia estate snapped toward the entrance hall. Rose froze. The silver serving tray was already slipping from her hands. Kwan Seah, the untouchable bride-to-be, towered over her, eyes blazing with irrational fury. A crystal glass lay shattered on the Persian rug, its contents splashing across Seah's six-figure designer heels. "Look at me when I speak to you," Seah hissed, jabbing a manicured finger into Rose's shoulder. People were staring. Elite socialites snickered behind their champagne flutes. Rose, an immigrant who had spent 11 years invisible in this house, swallowed the humiliation. Her hands shook, not from weakness, but because her mother's kidney treatments back in Lagos depended entirely on this paycheck. She was cornered. She couldn't fight back. Before you watch this ruthless elite cross a line she can never uncross, let me ask you something. Have you ever been forced to swallow your pride just to survive? Have you ever had to kneel while someone cruel demanded an apology? If you know what it's like to be pushed to the edge, to hold your silence while waiting for justice, subscribe right now. Don't scroll past, because the woman in this story is about to be saved by the most dangerous secret in the room. But what nobody in that gilded hall noticed was the man standing by the fireplace. He didn't belong. He wore a faded dark coat. He looked exhausted, like a chauffeur who had wandered through the wrong door. But he wasn't drinking. He wasn't mingling. He was watching. His dark, unblinking eyes were locked entirely on Seah. Why was he staring? Why was his posture so unnaturally still? It wasn't the stillness of prey trying to hide. It was the absolute, terrifying calm of a predator calculating a strike. Seah stepped closer to Rose, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are nothing, just cheap help who doesn't know her place." In the corner, the quiet man adjusted the collar of his worn coat. As his hand moved, the dim light caught a thick, jagged burn scar wrapping around his knuckles, the kind of mark earned in blood, not boardrooms. Seah raised her hand. The swing was fast, brutal. The crack of her palm against Rose's cheek echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Rose stumbled back. Her cheek burned like fire. The room went dead silent. Seah smiled, a cold, triumphant smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she had put a nameless maid in her place. She had no idea she had just signed her own destruction. The sound of the slap hung in the air like a gunshot. Rose stood perfectly still. She brought a trembling hand to her stinging face. She refused to cry. "Do not take revenge. Leave room for God's wrath," she repeated in her mind, locking her jaw. But the air in the room had suddenly changed. It didn't feel like a high society dinner anymore. It felt like a tomb. Rose looked up past Seah's glaring eyes and locked her gaze on the corner of the room. The man in the worn coat was watching her. Only her. Earlier that evening, Rose had been the only person to offer him a glass of water and a warm plate of food when the entire party mocked his cheap clothes. Now his expression was entirely unreadable. But the atmosphere around him was warping. He took a single step forward. A heavy, a suffocating pressure radiated outward. A few guests instinctively backed away without knowing why. The hair on the back of Rose's neck stood up. By the entrance doors, the estate manager pulled his phone from his pocket. It had been vibrating for 40 minutes. He glanced at the glowing screen. All the blood drained from his face. His knees buckled slightly, his hands shooting out to catch the edge of a side table. Seah dusted off her hands, completely oblivious to the shifting gravity. "Clean this up immediately," she snapped at Rose, turning her back on the maid to face her audience. Honestly, the incompetence in this house. Seah. It was just one word. It wasn't shouted. It was quiet, precise, absolute. But it sliced through the room, freezing the blood of every billionaire and socialite present. Seah stopped mid-sentence. Her shoulders stiffened. She turned around, annoyed, ready to destroy whoever had dared interrupt her. Then her eyes landed on the man in the faded coat, the man her friends had called a chauffeur, the man she had completely ignored, the man whose patience was a legendary, terrifying weapon. The color vanished from Seah's flawless face. Her breath hitched, because in that split second, she realized she wasn't looking at a nobody. She was looking at Yoo Sang-ho. and his dead dark eyes were staring directly at the red mark she had just left on Rose's face. To understand why a billionaire was ready to destroy his own wedding, you have to rewind. Exactly 2 hours before the glass shattered. Rose had been running the kitchen like a medic in a war zone. 60 elite guests, 0 breaks. Her feet ached, but her spirit held firm. Outside, a modest black sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. No security details, no flashing cameras. A man stepped out, mid-40s, wearing a dark faded coat that looked like it had survived a war. He walked through the grand doors without an invitation. The estate manager completely ignored him. Seah's wealthy friends laughed, whispering loudly enough to carry across the marble floor. "Who let the driver in?" The man didn't flinch. He didn't introduce himself. He just found a quiet spot in the shadows by the fireplace. Watching, waiting, testing. For an hour, the man stood in the shadows, invisible. Waiters passed him by. Guests bumped his shoulder without a single apology. His jaw tightened. A silent storm was brewing. He reached for a glass of water from a side table. It was empty. He set it down, still watching. Across the room, Rose saw everything. She saw the disrespect. She saw the empty glass. She didn't know he was the ruthless Yoo Sang-ho. She just saw a tired stranger being treated like dirt. So she broke the rules. Rose picked up a fresh pitcher, walked past the billionaires, and stopped right in front of him. She poured the water, offering a warm, genuine smile. "You look like you've had a long drive, sir. I can bring you some hot food." The man froze. For the first time all night, someone looked at him. "You don't have to do that." His voice was low, heavy. Rose simply smiled. "Nobody has to be kind. That's what makes it worth doing." Rose walked away toward the kitchen, leaving the quiet man in the shadows. But the cruelty of the room wasn't done with him yet. Minji, a socialite who only existed to agree with whatever Seah said, Wade noticed the stranger holding his water glass. She nudged Seah sharply. "Seriously," Minji whispered, intentionally speaking loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "Who let the chauffeur drink from the crystal? He's getting grease and fingerprints all over it." Laughter rippled through the immediate circle. Light, polished, utterly toxic. Seah didn't even turn her head to look at him. She simply rolled her eyes and took another delicate sip of her champagne. "Security is getting so lazy lately. Just ignore him. He probably slipped in looking for a handout." The man in the corner said absolutely nothing, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. His eyes grew a shade darker. He was handing them a rope, and Seah was happily tying the knot around her own neck. Everyone in that lavish hall thought they were untouchable. They thought they held all the power in the room. They were dead wrong. While the elite guests laughed at the stranger in the worn coat, Rose quietly slipped back out of the kitchen. She wasn't carrying more champagne for the billionaires. She was carrying a small, warm plate of food. She had even sneaked a side of spicy kimchi jjigae onto the tray. The chef had made it for himself earlier, but Rose instinctively thought the tired man in the shadows might need something that felt like a piece of home. She walked right past Minji. She ignored Seah's piercing glare from across the floor. She stepped back into the quiet corner, approached the man, and offered him the plate. "Here you go," Rose said softly. "It's been a long night." The man looked down at the steaming food. Then very slowly, he looked up at Rose. The cold, with terrifying stillness in his dark eyes fractured. Just for a single second, he had endless money. He owned businesses across the globe. He had incredibly powerful men completely terrified of his name. But in a room packed with people desperate to impress him, the only person who treated him with a shred of dignity was the maid everyone else treated like trash. "Thank you," he said. The emotional weight in his voice was thick. Rose nodded, offered a small smile, and walked away to finish her shift. She didn't know it yet, but she had just secured the ultimate protection. You know what's powerful? She didn't help him because he was important. She helped him because he was human, and the world rarely rewards women like that. If you've ever done the right thing when nobody was watching, you already feel this. Don't just watch silently. Subscribe. Join a space where quiet strength finally gets the recognition it deserves. For the next 2 hours, the quiet man didn't move from his corner. He slowly ate the warm food Rose had brought him. Every bite felt like a silent rebellion against the cold, artificial wealth filling the room. His dark eyes tracked Rose as she navigated the crowded floor. She was entirely invisible to them, a ghost carrying crystal trays, cleaning up spills, absorbing the harsh, demanding voices of the elite without a single complaint. He watched a billionaire snap his fingers right in her face. He saw her nod respectfully, her expression a masterclass in quiet endurance. But beneath that dignity, he saw the deep, suffocating exhaustion in her shoulders. The heavy sorrow of a woman carrying a burden much larger than anyone in that room could survive. He didn't know about her sick mother back in Lagos. He didn't know about the desperate tears she shed in her daily prayers. But a man like Yoo Sang-ho understood survival. He recognized a warrior when he saw one. And he recognized the absolute rot inside the woman he was supposed to marry. Across the grand hall, Seah was holding court. She laughed loudly, posing for photos, utterly obsessed with her own reflection. She had the perfect face, the perfect pedigree, and an entirely empty soul. Sang-ho set his empty plate down. The silent test was officially over. He had seen exactly what he needed to see. Now he was just waiting for the right excuse to burn her kingdom down. The jazz music played softly. The expensive champagne continued to flow, but the atmosphere inside the grand estate was growing heavy. A violent storm was closing in, and nobody but the man in the faded coat could feel the pressure dropping. It was almost time for dinner to be served. Rose hurried back and forth from the kitchen. Her legs burned from standing since 4 in the morning. She approached a decorative side table near the entrance to clear away the discarded glasses. She placed her heavy silver tray carefully against the wall, perfectly out of the main walking path. But Seah was moving through the crowd, demanding all the space in the room. She wasn't looking at the floor. She was only focused on the wealthy admirers fawning over her. Her 6-figure designer heel stepped blindly backward. It caught the heavy edge of Rose's tray. The metal shifted across the marble. A crystal glass wobbled dangerously on the edge. The executioner had finally found her excuse. The glass fell. It hit the marble floor in slow motion, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. A cold splash of champagne hit Seah's ankle. The elegant jazz music seemed to instantly fade into nothing. Seah stumbled slightly, her flawless face flushing with a sudden, ugly heat. She was the center of attention, but for the first time all night it was because she looked foolish. And a woman like Kwan Seah could not handle looking foolish. Her embarrassment demanded a sacrifice. It needed somewhere to land. She spun around, her eyes wild, locking onto the closest, most defenseless target in the room. Rose. Rose was already stepping forward, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of pure helplessness and deep, heavy sorrow. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. Let me clean." "You stupid girl!" Seah's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the sudden silence. Every billionaire, every socialite, every servant turned to look. Seah pointed a trembling, furious finger at the spilled drinks. "You left that tray in the middle of the floor. Do you have any idea how much this dress cost?" Rose opened her mouth to explain. The tray had been placed tightly against the wall. It was safely out of the walking path. But looking into Seah's furious eyes, a heavy, suffocating sorrow washed over her. She realized the painful truth. Seah didn't want an explanation. She wanted an execution. What happened next silenced the entire estate. Seah raised her hand, pulling her arm back with vicious, unrestrained intent. The strike was fast, brutal. Crack. The sound of her palm hitting Rose's cheek was sickeningly sharp. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings like something physically breaking inside the room. For one suspended, terrifying moment, time stood perfectly still. The socialites froze with their crystal glasses half raised. The estate manager stopped breathing by the heavy wooden doors. Rose stumbled backward, a deep, helpless sting radiating across her face. Slowly, her shaking hand came up to touch her rapidly bruising cheek. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, heavily burdened by the profound sorrow of a woman who had given 11 years of faithful service, only to be struck down like an animal. But she did not let the tears fall. She simply swallowed the fire in her chest. Rose stood perfectly still. Her hand pressed gently against her burning cheek. The physical pain was sharp, but the deep, suffocating sorrow in her chest was much heavier. For 11 years, she had poured her heart into this house. She had cleaned its floors, served its guests, and carried the quiet, helpless burden of surviving in a world that refused to see her. And this was her reward: public humiliation. The elite crowd watched her in dead silence. Not a single billionaire stepped forward. Not one socialite spoke up. They simply stared, waiting for the broken maid to finally shatter. But Rose refused to give them the satisfaction. Her eyes glistened with tears she stubbornly held back. She possessed a quiet, unshakable dignity that their money could never buy. "Do not take revenge," she reminded herself, locking away the fire in her throat. "Leave room for God's wrath." She took a slow, trembling breath and lowered her eyes, preparing to apologize for a mistake she never made. But before a single word could leave her mouth, the heavy silence of the room was broken. Not by a loud gasp, not by an apology, but by a voice from the shadows. Seah. Just her name, nothing more. But the sheer authority in that single word caused the temperature in the grand hall to instantly drop. It was not a shout. It was a cold, absolute command that bypassed argument entirely. Seah froze. Her manicured hand hovered in the air. The arrogant smirk vanished from her flawless face, replaced by a sudden spike of sharp irritation. How dare someone interrupt her moment of dominance? She turned sharply, ready to completely destroy whoever had the nerve to speak to her like that. But when her furious eyes finally landed on the dark corner by the fireplace, all the breath violently left her lungs. The man in the worn coat stepped out of the shadows. He was no longer hiding his terrifying gravity. As he slowly walked forward, the surrounding billionaires instinctively parted like the Red Sea, terrified to even breathe near him. Seah's knees suddenly felt incredibly weak. She stared at the man her friends had viciously mocked, the stranger she had ignored all night. His dark eyes were locked on her, and they were dead. The uninvited chauffeur was actually the powerful groom. The terrifying trap had snapped completely shut on her. By the heavy entrance doors, the estate manager was visibly shaking. He had finally checked the unread message on his phone 40 minutes too late. All of the warm blood drained from his face. The quiet man standing in the faded coat was not a lost driver. He was Yoo Sang-ho. The Yoo Sang-ho. The undisputed boss whose name commanded absolute fear across global empires. The man who wielded his silence like a loaded weapon. Sang-ho had arrived early, without his security detail, to run a test. He wanted to witness exactly how his future bride treated people when she believed no one of importance was watching her. And he had seen every vile, unforgivable moment. The cruel, toxic laughter, the empty water glass, the sudden, violent strike against a woman who possessed far more dignity than the billionaires mocking her. He stopped inches away from Seah. The suffocating terror in her eyes was absolute. She was entirely helpless now, Anna suddenly trapped inside a brutal nightmare of her own making. The deep sorrow she had just inflicted on Rose was about to be returned to her with very crushing interest. She had played a vicious, arrogant game, and she had completely lost everything tonight. When the truth came out, when she realized who he really was, it was already too late. Not because she was in danger, but because fate had already chosen her. And here's the part nobody talks about. The world fears powerful men, but it underestimates powerful women. If you've ever been underestimated, this channel is your space. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but for every moment a silent woman changed her destiny. "Kneel," he said. It was not a request. It was not shouted across the room. It was the kind of cold, terrifying instruction that lives below sound. And it bypassed any argument and went directly to the part of the brain that understands absolute consequence. Seah blinked rapidly. Her mind rejected the reality of her own downfall. Surely she had misheard him. "Sang-ho, please." "Kneel." The single word struck her harder than any physical blow. Seah's knees violently gave out. They heavily hit the expensive Persian rug she loved. The woman who had mocked a stranger's coat, who had laughed at empty glasses, who had raised her hand against a woman who served her faithfully, that woman was now on the ground. She was trembling, hands clasped, looking up at the man she thought she controlled. She looked utterly helpless, completely stripped of her fake power. A crushing sorrow filled the silence, but it belonged entirely to her broken pride. and Rose stood nearby. Her hand still rested gently on her bruised cheek. Her wide eyes were filled not with triumph, but with pure, sacred shock. She was watching a brutal, immediate justice she had stopped expecting 11 long years ago. There is a brutal truth that arrogant people always learn too late. The quiet individuals you treat as invisible are often the ones heaven watches most closely. Rose never needed a billionaire to validate her existence. Her worth was forged during 11 years of heavy sorrow, in the lonely, helpless hours before dawn when she prayed for her mother's life. But true justice has a strange way of arriving. It is never early, but it is never late. That night, the most dangerous man in the room walked in disguised as a nobody, and the only soul who offered him kindness was the maid everyone else treated like dirt. And the billionaire completely purged his life of the toxic bride. Seah was left kneeling in her ruined dress, utterly helpless, drowning in the bitter sorrow of her own arrogance. But Rose, she quietly finished her shift. She went back to her small apartment, called her sick mother in Lagos, and knelt on her own floor. She prayed the exact same prayer she had whispered for 11 long years. Thank you for seeing me, even when the world did not. And he always had. In the end, it wasn't money, it wasn't protection, it was respect. And sometimes that's the rarest reward of all. If this story reminded you that kindness is never weakness, subscribe to Urban Case Stories right now, because somewhere out there, another woman is choosing goodness in silence, and your one click helps her story be told.